I found out my son had been ignoring my calls the same morning my chemo nurse asked me who would be driving me home. And I said, no one, like it was the most normal answer in the world. Because at some point, you stop expecting people to show up, even your own child, even the boy you once held through sleepless nights and fevers, even the man who used to call you every Sunday without fail. And that was the moment something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet understanding that I was on my own now, truly on my own, sitting there in that cold clinic chair with a thin blanket over my legs and the faint smell of antiseptic in the air, watching other patients being helped up by spouses or daughters or friends. And I told myself it didn't matter, that I was strong enough, that I had always been strong enough. But strength has a way of feeling very different when you're walking to your car alone after chemo, your hands trembling just enough to make you grip the steering wheel a little tighter. And the drive home felt longer than it used to, every red light stretching out like time itself had slowed down just to remind me how quiet my life had become. And when I got back to the house, I noticed how still everything was. No television humming in the background, no footsteps upstairs, just the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. And I set my purse down, carefully, like even small movements required thought. Now, and I remember thinking I should check my account, just to make sure the hospital payment had gone through, because bills had a way of piling up faster than I could keep track of lately. And I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I used to serve Sunday dinners, where Daniel would laugh and Jessica would smile that polite, distant smile of hers. And I opened my laptop, typed in my password, and waited for the screen to load. And when it did, I stared at the number for a long time. Longer than I should have, because it didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. The balance was wrong. Completely wrong, and I refreshed the page once, twice, thinking maybe it was a glitch, maybe the system hadn't updated yet, but it stayed the same, a number so low it didn't just worry me, it confused me, and I scrolled through the transactions, slowly, my eyes moving line by line, and that's when I saw it, transfer after transfer, amounts that weren't small, amounts that added up to something significant, something that should have been there. Something I was counting on without even realizing how much I depended on it. And for a moment, I just sat there, not reacting, not panicking, just staring. Because sometimes the shock doesn't hit all at once. It seeps in quietly, like cold air through a cracked window. And I tried to think logically. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe Daniel had moved the money for safekeeping. Maybe Jessica had helped reorganize things. She had always insisted on helping with finances. Said it would take the pressure off me, said I shouldn't have to worry about numbers at my age, and I had believed her, or maybe I had just wanted to believe her, because trusting your family is easier than questioning them. And I closed the laptop slowly, my hands steadier than I expected, and I told myself I would ask Daniel, that there had to be a reason. There always is. People don't just take from you without a reason, not your own child, not the one you raised. Not the one who used to look at you like you were the center of his world. And yet, as I sat there in that quiet kitchen, something deep in my chest told me this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was something else, something deliberate. And I didn't cry. Not then. Not later that night when I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the empty house settle around me. Because tears felt like a reaction, and I wasn't ready to react yet. I was still trying to understand. Still piecing together the small moments I had ignored, the missed calls, the shortened visits, the way Jessica would answer questions before Daniel even had a chance to speak, the way he avoided eye contact the last time I saw him, like there was something he didn't want me to see, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this hadn't happened overnight. This was something that had been building, quietly, patiently, while I was busy fighting something else entirely, something inside my own body. And I realized then that I had been fighting two battles at once, one I could see and one I couldn't, and the one I couldn't see had been happening right under my nose, in my own family. And I lay there in the dark, my hands folded over my chest, feeling the steady rhythm of my own breathing. And I made a decision, not out of anger, not out of fear, but out of something calmer, something colder. I wasn't going to confront them right away. I wasn't going to call and demand answers, because answers given too quickly are rarely honest. Instead, I was going to watch, to listen, to let them believe I was still the same woman they thought I was. Tired, trusting, unaware, because sometimes the only way to understand the truth is to give people the space to reveal it themselves. And as I closed my eyes that night, I realized something else, something that surprised even me. I wasn't afraid anymore, not of the illness, not of the loneliness, not even of what my own son might have done, because whatever was coming next, I would face it the same way I had faced everything else in my life, quietly, carefully, and on my own terms. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, not because I had slept well, but because sleep had become something shallow and restless, a place my body visited but never stayed, and I lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house, the same house that used to feel full, alive with voices and footsteps and laughter that now only existed in memory. And I turned my head slowly toward the nightstand where my phone rested, untouched, silent, no missed calls, no messages, nothing from Daniel. And I told myself that I would not check it again, that I would not wait for something that clearly was not coming. And I sat up carefully, the familiar heaviness settling into my bones, a reminder that my body was still fighting something I could not see. And I moved through my morning slowly, making coffee, though I only drank half a cup, standing by the window as the first light stretched across the yard, and I noticed how the grass needed trimming, how the mailbox leaned slightly to one side. Small things I used to ask Daniel to help with, small things that now stayed undone, and I realized I had stopped asking long before he stopped showing up, and that thought stayed with me as I got dressed for my appointment. Choosing a sweater that felt soft against my skin, something simple, something that did not remind me of how much had changed, and when I stepped outside, the air was cool, carrying that faint morning chill that used to feel refreshing but now just felt empty, and I drove myself again, hands steady, eyes focused, because there was a certain kind of control in doing things alone, even when you did not choose it. And the clinic looked the same as always, clean, quiet, efficient, a place where people moved gently, spoke softly, and avoided saying too much. And I checked in, nodded to the receptionist, and took my seat among the others. And I noticed a woman across from me holding her husband's hand, her fingers wrapped tightly around his, and he leaned close, whispering something that made her smile. And I looked away, not because it hurt exactly, but because it reminded me of something I no longer had. And when my name was called, I stood, followed the nurse, and settled into the chair, the same routine, and as the process began, I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to think, to go over the numbers again, the transfers, the dates, the pattern that had started to form in my mind. And I remembered something Jessica had said months ago about simplifying things, about moving money into a better system. And I had nodded then, trusting her tone more than her words. And now that memory felt different, sharper, like a piece of a puzzle I had overlooked, and I opened my eyes and watched the slow drip of the four, each drop measured, controlled, predictable, unlike everything else in my life at that moment. And I realized I needed more than guesses, more than memories. I needed proof, something clear, something undeniable. And when the session ended, I did not go straight home. Instead, I drove to the bank, a place I had not visited in person in a long time, because everything had been handled online, handled by Jessica. And as I walked inside, the air felt cooler, the space quiet and orderly, and I approached the counter, asked to speak with someone about my account. And I kept my voice calm, steady, because there is a certain power in calmness, in not revealing what you already suspect. And the woman who helped me was kind, professional, and she pulled up my records, turning the screen slightly so I could see. And there it was again, the same pattern, the same transfers, but this time with details, account numbers, timestamps, confirmations, and I leaned in slightly, reading each line carefully, and I asked questions, simple questions, about authorization, about access, about how these transfers were approved, and she explained the process, the permissions, the fact that someone with authorized access could move funds without issue. And I nodded, thanked her, asked for printed statements. And when she handed them to me, I held them carefully, like something fragile, something important. And as I walked back to my car, I did not feel confused anymore. I did not feel uncertain, because the pieces were no longer scattered. They were aligned, clear, and undeniable. And I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, the papers resting on my lap, and I looked down at them, at the numbers, the dates, The evidence of something that had been happening quietly, deliberately, while I was focused on surviving day by day. And I thought about Daniel, about the way he used to look at me, the way he used to say, "Mom, I have got you." And I wondered when that changed, when those words became something he no longer meant, or maybe something he no longer controlled. And I thought about Jessica, her careful smile, her polite tone, the way she always seemed one step ahead in every conversation. And I understood then that this was not just about money. It was about control, about decisions made without me, about a life that had slowly been taken out of my hands piece by piece. And I sat there for a long time, longer than I needed to, because once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. And I knew what I had to do next, but I also knew I could not rush it, because truth, real truth, needs space to reveal itself completely. And as I finally started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, I made another quiet decision. I would not confront them yet. I would not show them what I knew, not until I understood how far this had gone, not until I was certain of every detail. Because if they believed I was still unaware, if they believed I was still trusting, then they would keep acting the way they had been acting. And sometimes the only way to see someone clearly is to let them think you are still in the dark. And as I drove home, the road stretching out ahead of me, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not sadness, but something steadier, something colder, a clarity that I had not felt in a long time. And for the first time since all of this began, I was not just reacting. I was preparing that evening. I set the table for 3, the same way I used to on Sundays, even though it was not Sunday and no one had asked to come over, because habits have a way of lingering long after the reasons for them are gone. And I moved slowly, placing each plate with care, aligning the silverware just enough to feel familiar, not perfect, just familiar. And I chose the good dishes without thinking about it, the ones Daniel used to like, the ones Jessica once complimented with that soft, measured tone of hers. And I could almost hear her voice in my head, polite, distant, always controlled. And I wondered if she would sound the same tonight, or if something in her would shift now that I had begun to see what had been hidden. And I checked the time, then my phone, still nothing, no message, no call. And for a moment I considered canceling the dinner I had not even confirmed. But then I remembered the way truth reveals itself best when it is given room. And I picked up the phone and called Daniel, letting it ring twice before he answered, his voice slightly distracted, like he was doing something else, something more important. And I said simply that I had made dinner in it. Would be nice if they came by. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, just a simple invitation. And there was a pause on the line, just long enough to notice. And then he said they would try. And I said that was fine, that I would be here. And I hung up before he could add anything else. And I stood there for a moment holding the phone, feeling the quiet settle around me again. But this time it felt different, not empty, but waiting. And I finished setting the table, adjusted the napkins, checked the oven, small movements that gave my hands something to do while my mind stayed focused, steady. And when the doorbell finally rang, it was later than I expected, almost an hour past the time I had mentioned. And I walked to the door at the same pace I always did, not rushing, not hesitating. And when I opened it, Daniel stood there with Jessica just behind him, her expression already arranged into that careful smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. And he stepped inside first, giving me a brief hug that felt more like a formality than anything else. And she followed, her heels clicking softly against the floor, her eyes scanning the room in a quick, subtle way that I might not have noticed before. But now I did. Now I noticed everything. And we sat down at the table, the 3 of us, the plates still warm, the food untouched for a moment as we settled into a conversation that felt polite on the surface, but carried something else underneath, something unspoken. And Daniel asked how I was feeling, his voice careful, measured, and I said I was managing, that the treatments were tiring but necessary. And he nodded, looking down at his plate for a second longer than needed. And Jessica added that I should consider cutting back on stress, that it was important to focus on recovery. And I smiled slightly, because the suggestion sounded kind, but the tone behind it felt different, like a reminder, like a subtle push toward something I had not yet agreed to. And we began eating, the sound of forks against plates filling the spaces between words. And I let the silence stretch just enough before speaking again, asking casually about work, about their plans, about anything that would keep the conversation moving without revealing too much, and I watched them as they spoke. The way Jessica answered quickly, smoothly, the way Daniel followed her lead without realizing it. Or maybe realizing it, and choosing not to change it. And I noticed the small things, the exchanged glances, the slight pauses, the way certain topics were avoided entirely. And it became clear that whatever had been happening with my account was not something they intended to bring up. Not something they thought I knew. And that understanding settled in quietly, confirming what I had already begun to piece together. And halfway through the meal, Jessica mentioned something about finances, something vague about planning ahead, about making sure everything was organized. And I set my fork down gently, looked at her, and asked what she meant, keeping my voice calm, neutral, and she smiled again, that same careful smile, and said that it might be a good idea for me to consider letting them help manage things more directly, especially given my health. And Daniel nodded beside her, adding that it would take pressure off me, that I should not have to worry about bills or accounts. And I listened, really listened, to the words, to the way they were presented, to the assumption behind them. And I realized that this was not a suggestion, it was a continuation of something already in motion, something they believed I had accepted without question. And I leaned back slightly, in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. And for a moment, I said nothing, letting the silence return, heavier this time, more deliberate, and I saw it then, just for a second, the flicker of uncertainty in Daniel's expression, the quick glance he gave Jessica, as if waiting for her to guide the next step. And she did, almost immediately, shifting the conversation, smoothing over the moment with a comment about dessert, about how lovely the meal was. And I nodded, stood up, and moved to the kitchen, my movements steady, controlled. And as I plated the dessert, I allowed myself one quiet thought, not emotional, not reactive, just clear. They still believed I did not know. They still believed they were in control. And that was exactly where I needed them to be, because the truth, when it finally surfaces, has a way of hitting harder when it is least expected. And as I carried the plates back to the table, I felt that same steady clarity from earlier settle in again, calm, precise, and ready. Because this was no longer about what they had done, it was about what I would do next after they left that night. I did not clean the table right away. I just sat there for a while, looking at the empty chairs, the half-finished plates, the small details people usually overlook, like the way Jessica had barely touched her food or how Daniel kept checking his phone between sentences, and I let those details settle into place, not as separate moments, but as part of something larger, something that had been unfolding long before I chose to see it clearly. And when I finally stood up, I moved slowly, gathering the dishes, rinsing them one by one, letting the rhythm of simple tasks give my mind space to think, not about what I had already confirmed, but about what I had not yet uncovered, because what I saw at the bank was only the surface, and people do not make careful, repeated decisions like that without a reason, without a plan, and I needed to understand the plan, not just the action, and that thought stayed with me through the night and into the next morning. When I sat again at the kitchen table with the printed statements spread out in front of me, each page aligned neatly, each line marked with a small note I had written in the margins, dates circled, amounts underlined, patterns traced, and the more I looked, the clearer it became that the transfers were not random. They followed a rhythm, spaced out just enough to avoid immediate notice, always occurring after specific days, days that now stood out to me, appointments, treatments, moments when my focus had been elsewhere. And I realized then that this had not just been planned, it had been timed, and that understanding changed something inside me, not in a loud or emotional way, but in a quiet, steady shift from uncertainty to clarity. And I reached for my phone, not to call Daniel, not yet, but to scroll through old messages, emails, anything that might connect the dates, and I found them, small, almost forgettable messages from Jessica, asking if I needed help with anything, offering to take care of things while I focused on my health, messages that had seemed thoughtful at the time, considerate even, but now read differently, now carried a weight I had not recognized before, and I set the phone down, leaning back slightly in my chair, and I allowed myself to think about the past, not just the recent past, but years back, to when Jessica first entered our lives, the way she presented herself, confident but warm, attentive in ways that felt genuine, The way she asked questions about everything, not just about Daniel, but about me, about the house, about how things were managed, and I had answered openly, willingly, because sharing knowledge felt natural, because including her felt right. And I could see now how those early conversations had laid the foundation for everything that followed. How trust had been built carefully, patiently, not to support, but to access. And I did not feel anger as that realization settled in. Not yet, because anger requires a certain kind of reaction, and I was still in the stage of observation, of understanding, and I knew that reacting too soon would only close doors that were still open, and I needed those doors open, needed them to continue believing that nothing had changed, that I was still unaware, still trusting, and that meant I had to play my part just as carefully as they had played theirs. And that afternoon, when Daniel sent a short message asking if I was feeling better, I responded simply, saying I was managing, that I appreciated him checking in, nothing more, nothing that would shift the balance, and I left it at that. And then I did something I had not done in a long time. I called someone outside the family, someone who knew me before all of this, someone who knew my late husband, someone who understood the way things used to be managed, and when he answered, his voice steady and familiar, I explained just enough to set the context, not everything, not the full picture, but enough to ask the right questions about access, about authority, about what could be done without my direct involvement, and he listened, quietly, asking a few questions of his own, and then he said something that stayed with me, something simple but important, that control is rarely taken all at once, it is given in small pieces, often without realizing it. And I thought about that after we hung up, about the small permissions I had granted, the trust one had extended, the decisions I had allowed others to handle, and I understood then that this situation was not just about what they had done, it was also about what I had allowed, not out of weakness, but out of trust. And there is a difference I could now see clearly. And as the day moved forward, I began to outline what needed to happen next, not in a rushed or emotional way, but methodically, step by step, starting with information, then confirmation, then action. And I wrote those steps down on a notepad, simple, direct, leaving space between each line, because space allows for adjustment, for clarity, and I knew that whatever came next would require both. And that evening, as the sun lowered and the house filled again with that quiet, steady stillness, I sat by the window, looking out at the yard, at the small details that had not changed, the leaning mailbox, the untrimmed grass, the familiar shape of the trees, and I realized that while so much had shifted beneath the surface, the outside world remained the same, unchanged, steady, and that steadiness felt grounding, reassuring in a way I had not expected. And I took a slow breath, letting it settle, letting everything settle, because this was no longer about reacting to what had happened. It was about preparing for what would happen next. And for the first time since I saw those empty numbers on my screen, I felt something close to certainty, not about the outcome, but about my role in it. Because I was no longer just someone being affected by decisions, I was someone about to make them. The following morning, I did not rush into anything. I did not call anyone. I did not confront anyone. Instead, I sat at the same kitchen table with my notepad and the printed statements, and I began to write down everything I knew, not just the transactions, but the conversations, the dates, the moments that now carried a different meaning, and I noticed how certain patterns aligned in a way that was too precise to be accidental. Transfers happening within hours after Jessica had visited, after she had offered to take care of things, after she had gently insisted that I should not worry about details. And I underlined those connections, drawing lines between events, creating a map that was no longer confusing, no longer fragmented, but structured and deliberate. And when I finished, I looked at the page for a long moment, not with shock, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement, because once you see something clearly, you no longer question whether it exists, you only decide what to do about it. And I folded the papers carefully, placed them in a folder, and set it aside. Not hidden, not exposed, just present, because this was no longer something I needed to react to immediately. It was something I needed to handle correctly. And as I stood up, I realized that the next step was not about gathering more evidence. It was about confirming the extent of control they believed they had. And that required observation, patience, and something else, something I had not used in a long time, restraint. And later that afternoon, when Jessica called unexpectedly, her voice light, almost cheerful, asking how I was feeling and whether I needed anything. I listened carefully, not just to her words, but to the tone beneath them, and I answered in a way that matched her expectation. I told her I was tired, that managing everything alone had become difficult, that sometimes I felt overwhelmed by the bills, by the paperwork, and I let my voice soften just enough to sound uncertain, not completely, but enough to create an opening. And there was a pause on the other end, brief, but noticeable, and then she responded exactly as I expected, offering to come by, to help organize things, to make sure everything was handled properly, and I agreed, simply, without hesitation, because this was the moment I had been preparing for, not a confrontation, not yet, but an opportunity to see how far she was willing to go when she believed I was no longer in control. And when she arrived that evening, alone this time, without Daniel, she stepped inside with the same composed presence, her smile carefully measured, her eyes briefly scanning the room before settling on me. And she asked how I was feeling, and I told her I was managing, that some days were harder than others, and she nodded, moving toward the table where I had placed a small stack of unopened mail, bills, statements, things I had intentionally left untouched, and she sat down, pulling the papers toward her, flipping through them with a practiced ease, as if this was something she had done many times before, and I watched quietly, standing nearby, allowing her to take the lead, allowing her to believe she was guiding the situation, and she began explaining things, pointing out due dates, suggesting ways to consolidate accounts, mentioning how it would be easier if everything were under one system, one point of management, and I listened, nodding occasionally, asking small questions, not challenging, not resisting, just enough to keep her talking, because people reveal more when they believe they are being trusted, and as she spoke, I noticed how confident she had become, how certain of her position, how comfortable she was making decisions without hesitation. And that comfort told me more than any document could. It told me that this was not new, that this was not a one-time action. It was a role she had already assumed, fully and without doubt. And after a while, she paused, looking up at me with that same composed expression, and she said it might be best if we formalized things, if I allowed her and Daniel to have full access, full control, so that I would not have to worry about anything moving forward. And I let a moment pass before responding, not too long, just enough to show that I was considering it. And then I said that maybe she was right, that maybe it was time to simplify things, and I saw it then, the smallest shift in her expression, a flicker of satisfaction, quickly hidden but not fast enough to go unnoticed, and she nodded, reaching into her bag, pulling out a folder, prepared, organized, as if she had anticipated this outcome, and she placed it on the table, opening it to reveal a set of documents, neatly arranged, ready for review, and I stepped closer, looking down at the pages, not reading them fully, not yet, but recognizing enough to understand what they represented: authorization forms, access permissions, legal language designed to transfer control in a way that appeared reasonable, even helpful, and I placed my hand lightly on the edge of the table, steady, calm, and I asked a simple question, whether Daniel had seen these documents, and she answered quickly, saying they had discussed it, that he agreed it was the best course of action, and I nodded, as if that was all I needed to hear. And in that moment, everything aligned, not just the transactions, not just the conversations, but the intention behind them, clear, structured, and deliberate. And I realized that this was no longer about discovering what had happened. It was about allowing it to continue just long enough for the full picture to emerge. Because when people believe they have already succeeded, they stop being careful. They stop hiding the details. And that is when the truth becomes undeniable. And as I looked at those documents on the table, I understood that I was no longer reacting to their plan. I was stepping into it on my own terms. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt completely certain about what needed to happen next. I did not sign anything that night. I did not rush. I simply told Jessica that I needed time to review the documents, that I wanted to make sure I understood everything clearly, and she nodded in that controlled way of hers, assuring me there was no pressure, that she only wanted to help. And I thanked her, genuinely calm, walking her to the door as if nothing had shifted between us. And when she left, The house returned to its quiet state, but this time it did not feel empty. It felt like a space I was finally seeing clearly, and I went back to the table, sat down, and opened the folder she had brought, reading each page slowly, carefully, not just the words, but the structure, the intent behind them, the way the language was designed to appear supportive while quietly transferring control, and I noticed how comprehensive it was, how it covered not only the accounts I already knew about, but also left room for expansion, for future decisions to be made without my direct involvement. And I closed the folder gently, placing it beside my own notes, and I allowed myself a moment to think, not emotionally, not reactively, but strategically, because what I had in front of me was not just evidence of what had been done. It was a clear outline of what they intended to do next, and that meant I had an advantage, something I had not had before, foresight. And I leaned back in my chair, looking out toward the darkened window, seeing only my reflection faintly against the glass, and I realized that this situation had moved beyond simple misunderstanding, beyond misplaced trust. It was now a matter of control, of who would decide what happened next, and for the first time, I understood that I still had more control than they believed, and that realization did not come with anger. It came with clarity, steady and precise, and the next morning, I began putting that clarity into action, not by confronting them, but by quietly restructuring what remained within my reach. And I started with something simple. I called the bank again, asked about additional safeguards, about alerts, about restrictions that could be placed on my accounts, and I listened carefully, asked the right questions, made small changes that did not draw attention but created boundaries. And then I reached out to the same trusted contact I had spoken to before, explaining a little more this time, enough for him to understand that I needed guidance not just on what had happened, but on how to move forward without escalating the situation prematurely. And he responded with the same steady tone, advising caution, patience, and documentation, and I followed that advice, organizing everything I had, creating a record that was clear, chronological, and undeniable. Because if this situation reached a point where explanation was no longer enough, I needed more than words, I needed structure. And over the next few days, I maintained the same pattern with Daniel and Jessica, responding to messages, answering calls, keeping my tone consistent, unchanged, giving no indication that anything had shifted, and I noticed how quickly they settled into that assumption, how easily they continued as if nothing was different. And that told me something important. It told me that they were not expecting resistance, not expecting awareness, and that gave me time, and time, in situations like this, is something you use carefully, not to delay, but to prepare. And one afternoon, Daniel called, his voice softer than usual, asking how I was doing, and I answered honestly, saying that the treatments were taking their toll, that some days were harder than others, and there was a pause on the line, a brief silence that carried more meaning than his words, and I could sense the hesitation, the uncertainty, something that suggested he did not fully understand everything that had been happening. And that realization added another layer to what I already knew, because while Jessica's actions had been deliberate, structured, Daniel's involvement felt different, less certain, less controlled, and I stored that observation quietly, not drawing conclusions yet, but recognizing that not everything in this situation was as straightforward as it first appeared. And later that evening, I sat again at the table, reviewing both sets of documents, mine and hers, and I began outlining the next phase, not just what I needed to protect, but how I would reveal what had already been done. And I understood that the moment of confrontation, when it came, needed to be precise, undeniable, and timed in a way that left no room for deflection, no room for reinterpretation. And that required more than evidence. It required context, sequence, and control of the situation itself. And I closed my notebook, resting my hands on the table, feeling the steady surface beneath my palms, grounding, familiar. And I realized that everything had shifted, not in a way that could be seen from the outside, but in a way that defined what would happen next. Because I was no longer reacting to their decisions, I was shaping the outcome, quietly, deliberately, and entirely on my own terms. The following days settled into a rhythm that looked ordinary from the outside. But beneath that surface, everything had changed, and I moved through my routine with a level of awareness I had not carried before, noticing not just what was said, but what was left unsaid, not just what was done, but when it was done and why, and I kept my responses measured, consistent, giving nothing away, because there is a certain advantage in being underestimated, in being seen as someone who does not question, who does not notice, and I allowed that perception to remain intact. And one evening, Jessica called again, her tone slightly more confident than before, asking if I had reviewed the documents, asking if I was ready to move forward, and I paused just long enough to sound uncertain, then told her that I had looked through them but still felt a little overwhelmed, that the details were difficult to follow, and I heard the shift in her voice immediately, the reassurance becoming firmer, more direct, as if she was stepping more fully into a role she believed I had already accepted, and she suggested coming over again, bringing Daniel this time, so we could go through everything together, and I agreed, because that was exactly what I needed, both of them in the same room, both of them believing they were guiding the outcome, and when the day came, I prepared the house the same way I had before, not out of habit this time, but with intention, setting the table, placing the documents where they would be seen but not immediately addressed, creating a space that felt familiar, controlled, and when they arrived, I greeted them with the same calm presence, the same steady tone, and we sat down together, the three of us, with the papers spread out between us, and Jessica began explaining again, her voice smooth, practiced, guiding the conversation with confidence, and Daniel listened, nodding. Occasionally, his attention divided between her words and the situation he seemed only partially aware of, and I let them speak, let them move through their explanation without interruption, because sometimes the most revealing moments come when you do not interrupt, when you allow people to fill the silence themselves. And as Jessica spoke, she referenced the accounts, the management, the need for efficiency, and she pointed to the places where my signature would be required, presenting it as a solution, as something that would make everything easier, and I watched Daniel during this. Watched the way his expression shifted slightly when certain details were mentioned, the way his eyes moved between me and the documents, as if trying to understand something that had not been fully explained to him. And that confirmed what I had begun to suspect, that his involvement was not as complete as hers, that there were parts of this plan he had accepted without fully examining. And I held that observation quietly, because it mattered, not for now, but for what would come later. And when Jessica finished speaking, she looked at me expectantly, waiting for agreement, waiting for confirmation, and I placed my hands on the table, resting them lightly against the papers, and I asked a simple question, not about the documents themselves, but about the transfers, about the money that had already been moved, and the room shifted in that moment, subtly but unmistakably, because the question did not fit the script they had prepared, and Jessica's expression changed just enough to reveal a brief flicker of something beneath the surface. And Daniel looked at me more directly than he had before, his attention now fully present, and I did not raise my voice, did not change my tone. I simply repeated the question, calmly, clearly, asking when the transfers had been made and why I had not been informed, and Jessica responded first, quickly, explaining that everything had been done for my benefit, that it was part of the management process, that it was meant to simplify things, and I listened, nodding slightly, as if considering her explanation, and then I asked another question, about authorization, about who had approved the transfers, and this time, the pause was longer, more noticeable, and Daniel's gaze shifted toward Jessica, waiting, expecting clarity, and I saw it then, the moment where assumption began to give way to uncertainty, the moment where the structure they had relied on started to loosen, and I did not press further, not yet, because pushing too hard too soon would only close the space I had created, and instead, I leaned back slightly, allowing the silence to settle again, heavier now, more deliberate, and I said that I needed more time, that I wanted to understand everything fully before making any decisions, and Jessica began to respond, her tone adjusting again, moving back toward reassurance, toward control, but the certainty was not as solid as it had been before, and Daniel remained quiet, his expression thoughtful, unsettled in a way that had not been there earlier, and I realized then that the first shift had already begun, not in the documents, not in the accounts, but in the balance between them, and that was enough for now. Enough to confirm that the next step would not be about revealing everything at once, but about allowing each piece to surface in the right moment, in the right sequence, and as they gathered their things and prepared to leave, I walked them to the door again. The same calm presence, the same steady tone, and when the door closed behind them, I stood there for a moment, feeling the quiet return, but this time it carried something different, something more defined, because what had been hidden was no longer entirely hidden, and what had been assumed was no longer entirely certain, and I knew that the next time we sat at that table, the conversation would not follow the same path, because the foundation they had relied on had already begun to shift. The house felt different after that evening. Not quieter, not louder, just clearer, as if something that had been blurred for a long time had finally come into focus, and I moved through the next few days with that clarity guiding every step, every word, every silence. And I noticed how Daniel's messages became more frequent, but less certain, short check-ins that felt more like questions than statements, as if he was trying to understand something he could not quite name, and I responded the same way I always had, calm, steady, giving nothing away, because I knew that whatever uncertainty he was feeling needed time to grow, needed space to take shape, and pushing it too soon would only force him back into the comfort of whatever explanation had been given to him. And Jessica, on the other hand, remained consistent, composed, her tone unchanged, her confidence still present. But there was something different now, something slightly more controlled, as if she was adjusting, recalibrating after that brief moment at the table when the conversation had shifted, and I could see it in the way she phrased her messages, more careful, more precise, reinforcing the same ideas but with just enough variation to maintain control. And I read those messages slowly, not just for what they said, but for what they revealed about her expectations, her assumptions, and I began to see the full outline of what she believed would happen next. And that understanding allowed me to move forward with something more than preparation. It allowed me to plan, and one afternoon, I sat down again with all the documents, both hers and mine, and I began to organize them in a way that would not just make sense to me, but would be undeniable to anyone who saw them. Grouping the transfers, aligning them with the messages, marking the dates where her involvement was clear, and as I worked, I felt no rush, no urgency, because this was no longer about catching something in the moment. It was about presenting a complete picture, one that could not be dismissed or explained away. And when I finished, I placed everything into a single folder, labeled simply, nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention, and I set it aside, not hidden, but not displayed, waiting for the right moment. And that moment, I knew, would not come by accident. It would need to be created carefully, deliberately, and I began thinking about how to do that, not through confrontation, not through accusation, but through structure, through a setting where the truth would surface naturally, without force. And I realized that the same table where everything had begun would be the place where it would end, because familiarity lowers defenses, it keeps people within their patterns, and patterns reveal more than pressure ever could. And later that evening, I called Daniel, not to ask questions, not to confront, but to invite, and I told him that I wanted to have dinner again, that there were things I needed to go over, practical things, and he agreed quickly, almost too quickly, as if he had been expecting something like this, and I told him to bring Jessica, that it would be easier if we were all there together. And there was a brief pause before he said yes, and I could hear something in his voice, not resistance, but uncertainty, and that was enough, because uncertainty, when left alone, tends to grow, and over the next 2 days, I prepared, not the way I used to, not with effort to make everything perfect, but with intention to keep everything controlled, simple, clear, and I chose what would be on the table, not just the meal, but the documents, placing them in a way that would not immediately draw attention, but would be impossible to ignore once the conversation shifted, and I thought about what I would say, not rehearsing words, but understanding the sequence, the order in which things needed to unfold, because timing matters, not just what is said, but when it is said. And as the evening approached, I moved through the house slowly, checking small details, the same way I always had, but now each movement felt deliberate, purposeful, and when the doorbell rang, I felt no hesitation, no doubt, only that same steady clarity that had been building since the moment I saw those empty numbers on the screen, and I opened the door to find them both there, Daniel with that same uncertain expression, Jessica with that same composed smile, and we moved inside, sat down, The three of us at the same table, the same setting, but nothing about it was the same anymore. And as the conversation began, light at first, surface level, I allowed it to flow, allowed them to settle into the familiar rhythm, because the truth does not need to be forced, it only needs the right moment to be seen. And as I watched them, listened to them, I knew that moment was closer than they realized, closer than they expected, and for the first time since all of this began, I was not just prepared for it. I was ready to create it. The moment settled slowly, not with a sudden shift, but with a quiet weight that pressed into the room as we sat at the table, the three of us, plates half finished, conversation moving in careful circles, and I let it continue just long enough for them to relax into it, just long enough for the familiar rhythm to take hold, because familiarity lowers attention. It makes people believe nothing has changed, and when I finally reached for the folder beside me, I did it without hesitation, without announcement, simply sliding it onto the table between us, and I saw the reaction immediately, subtle but clear, Jessica's eyes moving first, sharp and quick, Daniel's following a second later, slower, uncertain, and I opened the folder calmly, turning it so they could both see, not pushing it toward them, just placing it where it could not be ignored. And I said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch, because silence, when used correctly, reveals more than questions ever could. And after a moment, Daniel leaned forward slightly, his brow tightening as he looked at the pages, while Jessica remained still, her posture controlled, her expression carefully neutral, and I began to speak, not loudly, not with accusation, just stating what was already there, the dates, the amounts, the transfers, each detail placed in order, each connection clear. And I watched as Daniel's expression changed with each line, confusion giving way to recognition, recognition giving way to something heavier, something he was not prepared to face, and I did not rush, did not overwhelm the moment. I allowed each piece to settle before moving to the next, because understanding needs space, and when I finally paused, I looked at him, not at Jessica, at him, and I asked a simple question, whether he had known about these transfers. And the silence that followed was different from the ones before, not controlled, not measured, but uncertain, real, and he hesitated, his eyes shifting briefly toward Jessica before returning to the papers. And he said he thought everything had been handled, that he trusted the process, that he believed it was being done for my benefit. And I nodded slowly, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging the words. And then I turned my attention to Jessica, who had remained composed, her expression unchanged, but her stillness now carried a different weight, and I asked her the same question, calmly, directly, whether she had authorized the transfers, and she answered without hesitation, saying yes, that it had been necessary, that it was part of managing things efficiently, that it was meant to protect me, and I listened, letting her speak, letting her complete the explanation she had already prepared, and when she finished, I did not respond immediately. I let the words sit in the air, unchallenged, because sometimes allowing someone to hear their own explanation is more powerful than interrupting it. And then I reached for another page in the folder, sliding it forward, showing the authorization details, the access records, the timestamps that aligned too precisely to be dismissed. And I watched as Daniel leaned closer, reading more carefully now, his focus narrowing, his earlier uncertainty sharpening into something clearer, something that could not be softened by explanation, and I saw it then, the exact moment where assumption gave way to understanding, where the structure he had relied on no longer held. And he looked up, not at me, but at Jessica, his expression no longer uncertain, but questioning, and she met his gaze with the same composure, the same controlled tone, explaining again that everything had been done with good intention, that the details had been complex, that she had taken responsibility to simplify things, and I remained still, watching, because this was not my moment to speak. This was the moment where their understanding needed to align, where what had been hidden between them needed to surface without my interference. And as the silence returned, heavier now, more defined, I realized that the balance in the room had shifted. Completely, not through confrontation, not through force, but through clarity, and I placed my hands on the table, steady, grounded, and I spoke again, not to argue, not to accuse, but to state something simple. Something that could not be interpreted differently, that I had not been informed, that I had not given permission, that the decisions had been made without me. And I let those words stand on their own, without emphasis, without repetition, because truth does not need to be repeated when it is clear, and I watched as Daniel absorbed that, as the weight of it settled in. And I saw the moment where he understood not just what had been done, but what it meant, and the room remained quiet after that, no one rushing to fill the space, no one attempting to redirect the conversation, because there was nowhere left to redirect it to. And as I sat there, looking at both of them, I felt no anger, no urgency, only that same steady clarity that had guided me to this point, because everything that needed to be seen was now visible. Everything that needed to be understood was now in front of them, and what came next would not be determined by explanation, but by what they chose to do with that. Understanding Daniel did not speak right away, and that silence felt heavier than anything that had been said so far, because it was no longer the kind of silence that comes from politeness or hesitation. It was the kind that comes from realization, from something settling and that cannot be undone. And I watched him carefully, not with expectation, not with pressure, just observing, the same way I had from the beginning. And his eyes moved again across the pages, slower this time, more deliberate, as if he was seeing them for the first time without the filter of assumption. And when he finally looked up, his expression had changed, not dramatically, but enough to tell me that something inside him had shifted, and he asked Jessica a question, simple, direct, about why he had not been told the full extent of what had been done, and she answered quickly, her tone still controlled, explaining that it had been easier this way, that she had handled things to avoid confusion, that she had taken responsibility to make decisions efficiently. And I listened without interruption, because this was not my moment to guide the conversation, this was theirs, and Daniel did not respond immediately. He just looked at her, holding that gaze longer than before, and I could see the conflict there, not loud, not outward, but present, the space between what he believed and what he was now beginning to understand. And I remained still, my hands resting lightly on the table, because sometimes the most important part of a moment is not what you say, but what you allow to happen without interference. And after a while, he turned back to the papers, flipping through them more carefully, stopping at certain points, rereading details that now carried a different meaning, and I saw his jaw tighten slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, and he asked another question, this time about authorization, about how access had been granted, and Jessica explained again, referencing the permissions I had given earlier, the trust one had extended, and I did not interrupt, because that part was true. I had trusted, I had allowed access, but what she did not say, what she did not include, was the shift from assistance to control, the moment where support became decision-making without consent, and that distinction did not need to be argued. It was already visible in the documents, in the sequence, in the pattern that had been laid out clearly in front of us. And Daniel seemed to understand that, because he did not challenge me. He did not question the evidence. He only looked at it, absorbing it, and I could see the weight of it settling in. And for a moment, I thought about speaking again, about clarifying, about adding something to guide the conclusion, but I chose not to, because clarity does not need reinforcement when it is already complete. And after a long pause, he leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling in a way that suggested more than just breath. And he said quietly that he had believed everything was being handled correctly, that he had trusted that the process was transparent, and I nodded, acknowledging that, because belief and reality are often separated by details people do not look closely at. And Jessica responded again, her tone firmer now, emphasizing that everything had been done with intention to help, to manage, to protect, and I noticed how her language had shifted slightly, less about explanation, more about justification. And that shift mattered, because it revealed not uncertainty, but a decision to maintain control of the narrative, even as the foundation beneath it changed, and Daniel listened. But this time he did not nod immediately. He did not accept the explanation as easily, and I saw the difference, subtle but important, and the room remained quiet again. The kind of quiet that does not need to be filled, because everything that needs to be said has already been placed in front of you. And I realized then that this moment was no longer about uncovering what had happened. That part was complete. This was about what would come next, about how each of them would respond to what they now understood. And I placed the folder back on the table, closing it gently, not as a signal of ending, but as a way of marking that the information had been presented fully. And I looked at Daniel, meeting his gaze directly, and I said, something simple, that I had needed to understand what was happening, that I had taken the time to do so, and that I would now decide what to do moving forward. And I did not raise my voice, did not add emotion to the words, because the strength of a statement does not come from how it is delivered, but from the clarity behind it. And he nodded slowly, as if accepting not just the words, but the shift they represented. And Jessica remained composed, but I could see the calculation behind her. Stillness, the way she was already adjusting, already considering the next move, and that did not surprise me, because patterns do not disappear in a single moment. They evolve, they adapt, and I understood that whatever came next would require the same level of clarity, the same level of control. And as we sat there, the three of us, in that quiet space that had once been filled with something entirely different, I felt no need to rush, no need to force a resolution, because everything that needed to change had already begun to change, and the rest would follow in its own time, shaped not by assumption, but by what had now been seen clearly by all of us. The silence that followed did not feel temporary. It felt like something settling into place, something that could not be undone or reshaped by explanation. And I remained exactly where I was, my hands resting lightly on the table, my posture steady, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to uncover, only something left to say. And I took a slow breath, not to gather courage, but to mark the moment, because moments like this do not need force, they need clarity. And I looked at Daniel, not at Jessica, not at the documents, just at him, because this had always been about more than money, more than transactions. It had been about choice, about presence, about what he had seen and what he had chosen not to see. And when I spoke, my voice did not rise. It did not carry anger. It remained exactly as it had been from the beginning, calm, measured, and I said 4 words, simple, direct, words that did not need explanation. I needed you. You left, and I let them sit there, between us, without adding anything else, because anything more would only weaken what was already clear. And I watched as those words reached him, not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, like something breaking through a surface he had been standing on without realizing how thin it was. And his expression changed in a way I had not seen before, not confusion, not uncertainty, but something quieter, something deeper. And he opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, the words not coming, because sometimes there is no response that can match the weight of what has been said. And I did not help him. I did not fill the silence, because this was not a moment that needed to be softened. And Jessica shifted slightly beside him, her posture still composed, but her attention sharper now, her eyes moving between us, measuring, calculating, and she spoke, her tone controlled, attempting to redirect, to reframe, saying that everything had been done with intention to help, that difficult decisions sometimes need to be made. And I listened without interruption, because her explanation no longer carried the same weight, not after everything had been laid out clearly. And when she finished, I did not respond to her. I kept my focus on Daniel, because he was the one who needed to understand what those 4 words meant, not as a statement, but as a reflection of something that could not be reversed. And he finally spoke, his voice lower than before, not defensive, not assertive, but uncertain, asking what I meant. And I held his gaze, steady, and I explained, not with emotion, not with accusation, but with clarity, that when I was sitting in that clinic, when I was walking out alone, when I was trying to manage everything while my body was already fighting something else, I had needed him, not as someone managing accounts, not as someone making decisions, but as a son, present, aware. And that absence, that distance, was not something that could be explained by intention or corrected by paperwork. And I saw the realization settle deeper in him as I spoke, because the truth, when it is personal, carries a different kind of weight, one that cannot be redirected or minimized. And he looked down for a moment, his hands resting on the table, and then back up again, as if searching for something to say that would change the direction of what had already been set in motion. And I remained still, because there was nothing left to guide, nothing left to clarify. The meaning was already complete, and the room felt different now, not tense, not loud, just defined, as if the boundaries between us had been drawn clearly for the first time. And Jessica spoke again, her tone firmer, attempting to regain control of the conversation, suggesting that emotions were influencing perception, that the focus should remain on practical solutions, and I listened. But I did not engage, because the moment had already passed beyond where her words could reach, and I could see it in Daniel's expression, the way he no longer followed her lead as easily, the way his attention remained on me, on what had been said, on what it meant. And I understood then that the shift was complete, not because of anything dramatic, not because of confrontation, but because clarity had replaced assumption, and once that happens, things do not return to the way they were, and I sat back slightly in my chair, letting the moment settle fully, and I said nothing more, because there was nothing more to add. The statement had been made, the meaning understood, and whatever came next would not come from explanation, it would come from choice, from what each of them decided to do with what they now knew. And as I looked at both of them, I felt no anger, no urgency, only that same steady certainty that had been building from the beginning. Because this was not about winning or losing, it was about seeing clearly, and once you see clearly, you cannot go back to not knowing. And neither could they after that night. Nothing was said as they gathered their things and left, no raised voices, no dramatic endings, just the quiet sound of the door closing behind them and the echo of footsteps fading down the walkway. And I stood there for a moment, my hand still resting on the door, feeling the stillness settle around me again, but it no longer felt heavy. It no longer felt empty. It felt defined, as if something that had been unclear for a long time had finally taken its true shape, and I turned back into the house slowly, not rushing, not pausing, just moving forward, the same way I had learned to do through every difficult moment in my life. And I returned to the table, the same table where everything had unfolded, where the truth had been laid out piece by piece, and I began to gather the papers, placing them back into the folder carefully, not because I needed to hold on to them anymore, but because they represented something important, not just evidence of what had happened, but proof of what I had come to understand. And when everything was put away, I carried the folder to the cabinet and set it inside, closing the door gently, as if closing a chapter that did not need to be revisited again. And I moved through the house, turning off lights, straightening small things, not out of habit this time, but out of intention, because restoring order, even in small ways, has a quiet power to it. And later that night, as I sat by the window, looking out at the same yard, the same trees, the same stillness that had surrounded me before, I realized that nothing outside had changed, but everything inside had. And that difference mattered more than anything else. And the next morning, I woke up with a clarity I had not felt in a long time, not because the situation had resolved, but because I was no longer waiting for something to be explained, no longer hoping for something to return to what it once was. I had seen things clearly, and that clarity does not leave once it arrives. And I moved through my day with that understanding guiding me, making decisions that were simple but important, contacting the necessary people, adjusting what needed to be adjusted, not in reaction, but in intention. And I did not rush to inform Daniel or Jessica of these decisions, because they no longer required their awareness, not at this stage. And as the days passed, I noticed the distance between us settle into something more permanent, not forced, not dramatic, just present. And Daniel did reach out. His messages longer now, more thoughtful, as if he was trying to bridge something he had only just realized was there. And I read them. I considered them, but I did not respond immediately, not out of anger, but because response, like everything else, needed to be intentional. And when I did reply, it was simple, acknowledging his words without undoing what had already been understood, because some things, once seen, cannot be unseen and cannot be set aside as if they never happened. And Jessica's messages were different, still composed, still measured, but less frequent, as if she was recalculating, adjusting to a situation that no longer followed the path she had expected. And I did not engage with those messages beyond what was necessary, because there was no longer anything to discuss, not in the way there had been before. And as time moved forward, I found myself returning to small routines, the ones that had always been mine, not out of obligation, but out of choice. And I realized that for the first time in a long while, those routines felt like they belonged to me. Again, not something shared, not something managed by others, but something I controlled. And that sense of control did not come with pride or satisfaction. It came with a quiet steadiness, the kind that does not need to be acknowledged to be real. And one afternoon, as I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking at the sunlight stretching across the floor, I thought about everything that had happened, not as a sequence of events, but as a process, something that had unfolded over time, something that had required patience to understand and clarity to address. And I realized that the most important part of it was not the discovery, not the confrontation, not even the outcome. It was the moment I chose to see things as they truly were, without adjusting them to fit what I wanted them to be, and that choice had changed everything. And as I sat there, I felt no need to revisit the past, no need to question what could have been different, because understanding does not come from changing what has happened. It comes from seeing it clearly and deciding what comes next. And for me, what came next was simple. It was living in that clarity, making decisions that reflected it, and moving forward without carrying what no longer belonged in my life. And as I finished my coffee and stood up from the table, I looked around the house once more, not with nostalgia, not with regret, but with recognition, because this space, this life, was mine again, fully and without question, and whatever came next, it would be shaped by that truth, not by assumption, not by silence, but by something far steadier, something that no one else could take from me, because it was not something given, it was something I had chosen to claim for myself.